Nasha's scarred spirit recoiled at the towering stranger's unexpected declaration, her 33 years of solitude crumbling in an instant as the weathered cowboy's eyes locked with hers across the porch. "I'm past the age of falling in love," she whispered through trembling lips. But the raw honesty in his voice silenced her doubts when he replied, "I've lived all my days dreaming of your arrival." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The September wind carried the scent of sage across the mesa, whipping through the wooden slats of Jacob Reed's cabin, where he had spent the better part of 5 years carving a life from the unforgiving New Mexico territory. The building creaked against the desert gusts, its weathered boards bearing witness to countless seasons of harsh frontier weather. Jacob stood on his porch, his lean frame silhouetted against the setting sun, watching as a lone rider approached from the direction of the Navajo reservation lands to the west. At 38, he had grown accustomed to the rhythm of his days: rise before dawn, tend to his modest herd of cattle, repair endless fence lines, and return to an empty cabin where silence had become his constant companion. The isolation suited him after years of chaos. The war between the states had left him with nightmares and a bullet lodged too close to his spine for doctors to remove. The permanent ache was a reminder of everything he'd lost. The rider drew closer, and Jacob realized it was Nasha Begay, the Navajo healer who occasionally traded with settlers in the area. Her straight back and proud posture were unmistakable, even at a distance. She was well known among both her people and the scattered white settlers, respected for her healing knowledge but regarded with suspicion by many for refusing to conform to either world completely. Jacob watched her approach with curiosity. They had exchanged few words in the years he'd lived here, mostly polite nods when their paths crossed in town. He knew she spoke excellent English, having been educated at one of the government schools before returning to her people. The rumors about her were numerous: that she had refused marriage to return to her traditional ways, that she could communicate with spirits, that she had saved countless lives with her medicine. Jacob had never been one to put stock in rumors. She reined her horse to a stop before his porch, her dark eyes meeting his without hesitation. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice carrying the slight musical lilt of her native tongue beneath the English. "I come with a message from Agent Parker at the agency." Jacob nodded, moving down the steps to stand before her. "Miss Begay, would you like to water your horse?" A flicker of surprise crossed her face at the courtesy. Most settlers didn't offer such niceties to Indians, even those as respected as Nasha. "Thank you," she said, dismounting with the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime on horseback. While her horse drank from the trough beside his cabin, Jacob waited patiently. She was dressed in a traditional deerskin dress adorned with intricate beadwork, but wore a wool shawl against the cooling autumn air, a blending of her two worlds. Silver and turquoise adorned her ears and wrists, catching the late afternoon light. She was perhaps in her mid-30s, her face unlined but carrying the quiet wisdom of one who had seen much of life. "Agent Parker has received reports of renegade Apaches moving north through this area," she said finally, turning from her horse to face him. "He asks all isolated homesteaders to consider moving closer to town until the army can investigate." Jacob frowned. That's a 40-mile ride to deliver a warning that might come to nothing. The agent believed it worth the journey. Her expression remained impassive. 3 families to the south have already been attacked. The news settled heavily between them. Jacob had heard rumors of increased Apache activity, but nothing confirmed. "You made this ride alone, knowing there might be war parties nearby?" Something like amusement flickered in her eyes. "I know how to avoid being seen when necessary, Mr. Reed, and I know this land better than any Apache raiding party." "Still," he said, "it'll be dark soon. You shouldn't travel back tonight." Nasha glanced at the setting sun, measuring the remaining daylight. I had planned to make camp by the Western Creek. Alone? With hostiles in the area? Jacob shook his head. I have a spare room. It's not much, but it's secure. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Your neighbors would not approve of an Indian woman spending the night under your roof. My nearest neighbor is 20 miles away, Miss Begay, and I've never much cared for others' approval. He gestured toward the cabin. There's stew on the stove, and the room is private. Nasha hesitated, then nodded once. Thank you for your hospitality. I accept. The simple exchange masked the unprecedented nature of the arrangement. White men and Indian women had certainly shared quarters before on the frontier, but rarely with the respect Jacob was offering. He helped her unsaddle her horse and led the animal to the small corral beside his own mount. Inside the cabin, Jacob moved efficiently around the single main room, adding wood to the stove and setting out 2 bowls for the venison stew he'd prepared that morning. The cabin was sparsely furnished but meticulously clean. A table with 2 chairs, a small bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes, a rocking chair beside the fireplace, and a narrow bed in the corner. A ladder led to a small loft space. You can take the loft, he said, nodding toward the ladder. I'll sleep down here. Nasha stood just inside the doorway, observing the space with careful eyes. Her gaze lingered on the bookshelf. You read, she said, a statement rather than a question. Helps pass the winter nights. Jacob ladled stew into the bowls. Do you? Yes, at the school they insisted upon it. She moved to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines. Shakespeare, Emerson, the Bible, and a few dime novels, Jacob admitted with a hint of embarrassment. Not exactly high literature. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. We all need stories, Mr. Reed, even simple ones. They ate in a silence that gradually shifted from awkward to comfortable. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. When they finished, Nasha insisted on washing the dishes, her movements efficient and practiced. How long have you lived alone, Mr. Reed? She asked as she worked. 5 years here. Before that, I drifted some after the war. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups. And you? I've heard you have a place of your own, away from the main reservation settlements. Yes. After I returned from school, I could not quite fit back into my people's world, nor did I wish to live entirely in yours. She accepted the coffee, her fingers briefly brushing his. So I found my own path. Like you, I prefer solitude. Jacob nodded, understanding the complicated peace that came with isolation. It's simpler. Simpler, she agreed, though perhaps not always better. The admission hung between them, unexpected and honest. Jacob found himself studying her face in the lamplight, the high cheekbones, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the strength evident in her bearing. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional standards and everything to do with dignity and purpose. The Apache, he said finally. How serious is the threat? Serious enough. She met his gaze directly. They are hungry and desperate. The reservation they've been confined to cannot support them, and winter approaches. I do not blame them for fighting, but I do not wish to see more bloodshed on either side. And that's why you rode 40 miles to warn settlers who have taken your people's land? Her expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. I have chosen to live between worlds, Mr. Reed. That means I cannot simply choose sides as if life were that simple. I want peace. For everyone. The quiet conviction in her voice touched something in Jacob that had been dormant for years. Here was someone who understood the complexity of the world, who refused easy answers and comfortable certainties. As the night deepened around the cabin, He realized this unexpected visitor had awakened his curiosity about another human being for the first time in longer than he could remember. Morning came with the soft glow of dawn filtering through the cabin's single window. Jacob woke to the unfamiliar sound of movement in his home, the quiet rustling of someone trying not to disturb him. For a moment, the old war instinct surged, his hand reaching for the rifle he kept beside his bed before memory returned. Nasha Begay. The warning. His offered shelter. He found her outside, standing on his porch facing east, her lips moving in what he recognized as a morning prayer. He waited silently, unwilling to interrupt what was clearly a sacred moment. The rising sun cast her silhouette against the weathered boards of his cabin, her straight back and proud posture striking against the backdrop of mesa and distant mountains. When she finished, she turned to find him watching. If his presence disturbed her, she gave no sign. "I've made coffee," she said simply. "Thank you." He moved to join her at the porch railing, accepting the cup she offered. "Sleep well?" "Yes." A pause, then, "You called out in the night." Jacob stiffened. The nightmares were his private burden, remnants of Shiloh and Antietam that still haunted him years later. "My apologies if I disturbed you." "No need for apologies. Many warriors carry such dreams." Her gaze remained on the horizon. "My brother was the same after fighting the Mexicans." The simple acknowledgement of his suffering without pity or curiosity was unexpected. Most people either avoided mentioning his nightmares or pressed for details he had no desire to share. "Will you return to the agency today?" he asked, changing the subject. "Yes, Agent Parker will expect a report." She glanced at him. "You should consider his warning about moving closer to town." Jacob's jaw tightened. "This is my home. I won't be driven from it by rumors." "3 families dead is not a rumor, Mr. Reed." "Jacob," he corrected quietly. "If we've shared quarters, you might as well use my given name." Something like surprise flickered across her face before she nodded. "Jacob, then, and I am Nasha." The simple exchange of names seemed to shift something between them, an acknowledgement of mutual respect that transcended the usual boundaries between their peoples. "The families who were killed," Jacob said, "were they prepared? Armed?" "One was. The others—" She shook her head. "The attacks came at night. Very few shots fired. They were skilled raiders." Jacob considered this information, weighing it against his own capabilities. He had survived worse odds during the war, though he'd been younger then, faster. The constant ache in his back reminded him of his limitations. "I'll increase my vigilance," he said finally, "but this land is all I have. I can't abandon it." Nasha studied him, her dark eyes seeming to evaluate more than just his words. "Then perhaps you should not be alone." "Are you offering to stay, Nasha?" The question came with a half-smile that felt unfamiliar on his face. She didn't return the smile, but neither did she take offense. "I have my own responsibilities, but there is safety in numbers. Perhaps you should consider taking on a hand or two, at least until winter. Hands cost money, and most men worth hiring have their own places or families by now." He gazed out at his modest herd grazing in the distance. "Besides, I've grown accustomed to my own company." "As have I," she replied. "But there is a difference between choosing solitude and allowing it to become a prison." The observation struck closer to home than he cared to admit. His isolation had begun as necessity, a wounded veteran seeking peace and distance from a country torn apart by war. But over time it had become a habit, then a comfort, and finally something approaching fear of any alternative. Nasha seemed to sense she had touched a nerve, for she changed the subject. "Your cattle look healthy, better than most I've seen in this drought. There's an underground spring feeding the north pasture, keeps the grass green even in dry years." He had discovered it his second year on the property, a stroke of luck that had saved his small operation more than once. "A blessing," she said. "My people would say the spirits favor you, or that I was too stubborn to give up when better men would have." He finished his coffee. "I should check the herd before you leave. Would you like to ride along? It's not far." The invitation surprised them both. Jacob hadn't intended to make it, and from Nasha's expression she hadn't expected it. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. They rode side by side across the scrubby pasture land, the morning still cool enough for comfort. Jacob's bay gelding and Nasha's pinto mare fell into an easy rhythm together, picking their way through patches of sage and around occasional rock formations. The cattle, a small herd of perhaps 30 animals, raised their heads at their approach before returning to their grazing. "Longhorns?" Nasha asked, eyeing the distinctive spread of the animals' horns, crossed with Herefords, trying to get better meat with the same hardiness. Jacob pointed to a red-sided calf. "That one's from my best stock. Should fetch a good price come spring." Nasha's gaze swept the surrounding landscape, her attention seemingly divided between their conversation and monitoring the horizon. "You know much about breeding cattle?" "Learned from my father in Texas before the war. He had a spread 3 times this size." Jacob hadn't spoken of his family in years, yet the words came easily now. "Lost it all when he backed the Confederacy. He didn't survive to see surrender." "I am sorry," she said simply. "It was a long time ago." He adjusted his hat against the strengthening sun. "What about your family? They're on the reservation?" "My mother is. My father died when the soldiers first came to move us to the reservation. My brother..." She paused. "He lives with a band that refused to surrender. I see him rarely." The revelation was significant. Her brother was technically a hostile, yet she worked with the Indian Agency, another indication of how she straddled both worlds, belonging fully to neither. They completed the circuit of the pasture in companionable silence. As they approached the cabin again, Jacob noticed a cloud of dust on the horizon, riders approaching from the direction of town. "Were you expecting others?" Nasha asked, her posture tensing slightly. "No." Jacob reached for the rifle in his saddle scabbard, a precautionary measure. "But that's no war party. Too direct. Probably the territorial marshal making rounds." As the riders drew closer, Jacob recognized the lead figure, Marshal Davis from Fort Sumner, accompanied by 2 deputies. Their presence this far from town confirmed the seriousness of the Apache threat more effectively than any warning could have done. Marshal Davis reined his horse to a stop before the cabin, dust settling around the 3 riders as they surveyed Jacob and Nasha with undisguised surprise. The marshal was a burly man with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to retain much softness. He nodded a greeting to Jacob before his gaze settled questioningly on Nasha. "Reed," he said by way of greeting. "Didn't expect to find company out at your place." "Marshal," Jacob acknowledged, dismounting and approaching the riders. "Miss Begay brought a warning from the Indian Agency about Apache raiders. Arrived late yesterday, so I offered shelter for the night." The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly, but he kept whatever thoughts he had about the arrangement to himself. "Then she saved us a ride. That's why we're here, warning isolated homesteaders." He dismounted, his deputies following suit. "The situation's worse than we initially thought." Jacob gestured toward the cabin. "Coffee's still hot if you'd like some." The marshal nodded, tying his horse to the hitching post. Nasha had remained mounted, her expression carefully neutral as the lawmen approached. Jacob noted how the deputies kept casting wary glances in her direction. "Miss Begay," the marshal said with a respectful nod. "Agent Parker mentioned you'd volunteered to warn the northern settlements." "Yes." Her reply was brief but not discourteous. Inside the cabin, the space felt suddenly cramped with 5 people, Jacob poured coffee for the men while Nasha stood near the doorway, her body language suggesting she was prepared to leave at any moment. "We've confirmed 12 dead across 3 homesteads south of here," Marshal Davis said without preamble once everyone had coffee. "Men, women, children, no survivors. Army's sending a company from Fort Stanton, but they're 3 days out at best." Jacob absorbed this grim news, feeling the weight of it settle in his gut. "How many warriors?" "Tracks suggest maybe 15, 20 at most. Led by a chief called Mano Sangriento, Bloody Hand. He broke from the reservation 2 months back." The marshal's gaze shifted briefly to Nasha. "No offense intended, Miss Begay, but this band's particularly vicious even by Apache standards." "I take no offense at facts, Marshal," she replied evenly. "Mano Sangriento's reputation is known to my people as well. He believes the only way to drive out settlers is through terror." Jacob studied her face, impressed by her composure when many would assume she sympathized with the raiders, simply because of her heritage. "We're organizing defense at Fort Sumner," the marshal continued, "urging all isolated settlers to gather there until the army deals with this threat." "And my cattle?" Jacob asked. "My home? Just abandon them?" The marshal sighed, clearly having had this conversation multiple times already. "Your life's worth more than property, Reed. But I can't force you. I'm just delivering the warning." He set down his cup. "If you insist on staying, at least fortify what you can, and I wouldn't count on help arriving quickly if trouble finds you." One of the deputies, a young man with a sun-reddened face, spoke up. "Marshal, we should tell him about the Johnsons." Davis shot the deputy an irritated look before reluctantly nodding. "Found another homestead yesterday. Different from the others. The Johnsons' family of 5. They weren't killed outright. Taken captive instead." Jacob felt rather than saw Nasha tense beside him. "Captives?" "Tracks led east, not back toward Apache territory." The marshal's expression darkened. "We believe Mano Sangriento may be using them as bait to draw out rescue attempts, or worse." The implications hung heavy in the room. Captives taken by hostile raiders rarely met pleasant fates, especially women and children. Jacob had heard stories during his time in Texas, stories that still made his blood run cold. "How far east?" Nasha asked suddenly. The marshal looked surprised at her question. 15 miles, maybe 20. Hard to track in that rocky country." Jacob saw something shift in her expression, a decision being made. "I know that area," she said. "There are caves in the eastern foothills, traditional hiding places." "You think that's where they'd take captives?" Jacob asked. "It would be logical. Defensible position, water source, multiple escape routes." She addressed the marshal directly. "I could help track them." Davis studied her with open skepticism. "No disrespect, Miss Begay, but this isn't women's business, and your presence might complicate things if we do find this war party." Jacob saw a flash of anger in her eyes, quickly controlled. "Marshal," she said evenly, "I speak 3 Apache dialects. I know this territory better than any of your deputies, and I can move without being seen where your men would be spotted immediately." "She's right," Jacob found himself saying. "If anyone could find those captives without alerting the war party, it would be Nasha." The marshal looked between them, clearly weighing his limited options against his prejudices. "The Army won't take kindly to involving a reservation Indian in military matters." "Then don't tell them," Jacob said simply, "or tell them after the captives are safe." A long silence followed, broken only by the sound of horses shifting outside. "I need to report back to Fort Sumner," the marshal finally said. "Can't spare men to escort you there, Reed, if that's what you're choosing." "I'm staying," Jacob confirmed, "but I want to help with the Johnson family if possible." Marshal Davis rubbed his beard thoughtfully. If, and I mean if, I were to consider Miss Bigay's assistance, how would that work? She can't exactly ride into an army camp with information. I could be the intermediary, Jacob offered. My place is centrally located. Nasha could use it as a base for scouting, report to me, and I could relay information to you or your deputies. The arrangement was unorthodox enough to make the deputies exchange uncomfortable glances, but the marshal seemed to be considering it seriously. Agent Parker won't like his interpreter going missing, he observed. I will inform the agent of my intentions, Nasha said firmly. He knows my skills are valuable in this situation. After another moment's consideration, Marshal Davis nodded reluctantly. Fine, I can't officially sanction this, but... He sighed heavily. Those are children out there. I'll take help where I can get it. They spent the next hour discussing details, where messages could be left, what Nasha would look for, how Jacob would signal if he needed immediate assistance. The deputies continued to regard the arrangement with visible discomfort, but deferred to the marshal's judgment. When the lawmen finally mounted to leave, Marshal Davis leaned down from his saddle. Reed, he said quietly, this puts a target on your back in more ways than one. Some folks won't take kindly to your arrangement with Miss Bigay, Apache threat or no. Jacob met his gaze steadily. I stopped caring about some folks' opinions a long time ago, Marshal. Davis studied him a moment longer, then nodded. Expected as much. Good luck to you both. With a touch to his hat brim, he led his deputies away, dust rising behind them as they rode toward the next isolated homestead. As the riders disappeared from view, Jacob turned to find Nasha watching him with an unreadable expression. You didn't have to involve yourself, she said finally. Those children deserve whatever help we can offer. We? She questioned, her dark eyes searching his face. Yes, he said simply. We. The day after the marshal's visit, Nasha returned to Jacob's cabin with supplies and information. She had ridden to the agency as promised, informing Agent Parker of her plan to assist in locating the captives. According to Nasha, the agent had been reluctant but pragmatic. The Army needed all the help it could get, even if that help came in unexpected forms. He sent a message to Fort Stanton, she explained as she unsaddled her horse in Jacob's barn. The soldiers won't interfere with us if we find the Johnsons first. Jacob nodded, helping her with the heavy packs she'd brought. What did you tell him about staying here? A faint smile touched her lips. Only that I would be using your cabin as a base for scouting. He made his own assumptions about the arrangement. Assumptions that will spread, Jacob noted dryly. Does that concern you? Her dark eyes met his, searching. He considered the question honestly. 5 years ago, even 2, the idea of his reputation being tarnished might have troubled him. Now it seemed trivial against the larger concerns they faced. No, he said finally. Let them talk. We have more important matters. She nodded, seeming satisfied with his answer. I've brought maps, she said, changing the subject, of the eastern foothills. We should plan our first scouting route. Inside the cabin, Nasha spread several hand-drawn maps across Jacob's table. They were detailed in a way government maps never were, showing hidden springs, game trails, and landmarks only someone intimately familiar with the land would know. These are remarkable, Jacob said, studying the intricate drawings. Your work? Some. Others are copied from maps my grandfather made. Her finger traced a line of rocky outcroppings. These formations hide a series of caves. If I were hiding captives, this is where I would take them. How far? A day's hard ride. But approaching directly would be dangerous. We should circle north, come in from higher ground where we can observe without being seen. Jacob studied the proposed route, mentally calculating supplies and timing. 2 days out then, maybe 3 back if we find the captives. Yes. She hesitated, then added, "We should leave tomorrow at dawn. The new moon will give us better cover for scouting 2 nights from now." The "we" didn't escape Jacob's notice. He had assumed she would scout alone, reporting back to him as they'd discussed with the marshal. "You're planning for us both to go?" he asked carefully. She looked up from the maps, her expression determined. "If we find them, one person may need to create a diversion while the other leads the captives to safety, and—" She paused, seeming to choose her words deliberately. "The terrain is difficult. Your back might not—" "My back is my concern," he interrupted, more sharply than intended. The constant pain was a private burden, one he rarely acknowledged to others. That Nasha had noticed its effects on him was both unsettling and strangely intimate. "I meant no offense," she said quietly. "But if we are to succeed, we must be honest about our strengths and limitations. You are a better shot than I am. I move more silently in rough country. Together, we improve our chances." Her logic was sound, and Jacob found his irritation fading. "You're right," he conceded. "We'll go together." They spent the remainder of the day preparing, checking weapons, packing provisions, discussing contingencies. As evening approached, Jacob cooked a simple meal of beans and salt pork, while Nasha prepared a mixture of herbs in a small leather pouch. "Medicine?" He asked, nodding toward her work. "Yes, for pain, fever, infection." She tied the pouch closed. "The captives may need treatment when we find them." The quiet confidence in her voice, not if but when they found the Johnson family, struck Jacob. Her certainty wasn't bravado, but the calm assurance of someone who had faced impossible odds before and prevailed. "You've done this kind of thing before," he observed. "Tracking, rescue." She was silent for a moment, her hands still. 3 years ago, 2 children from the reservation wandered into the mountains. The agent said they were surely dead after 2 days missing. I found them on the 4th day, sheltering in a ravine. She looked up at him. "Sometimes people survive when others have given up hope." The simple story revealed much about her character, her determination, her refusal to surrender to conventional wisdom, her fundamental belief in possibility where others saw only tragedy. Jacob found himself wondering what other stories she carried, what other moments had shaped her into this extraordinary woman who moved so confidently between worlds. After dinner, they sat before the fire, the evening chill making the warmth welcome. Jacob found himself studying Nasha's profile in the flickering light, the proud line of her nose, the slight upturn of her lips even in repose, the dignified way she held herself. She was unlike any woman he had known, carrying herself with a quiet authority that demanded respect without asking for it. "Why did you never marry?" The question escaped him before he could consider its propriety. If she was startled by the personal inquiry, she didn't show it. "I was betrothed once after returning from the school," she said, her eyes on the fire. "A good man from my mother's clan, but I had changed too much during my years away. I could not be the wife he expected, silent, obedient, content with traditional ways. So you chose independence instead?" "Yes." She turned to look at him directly. "And you? Surely there were women who would have shared this life with you." "One," he admitted, "before the war. Her father owned land adjoining ours in Texas. We had an understanding, but not a formal engagement." The memory was distant now, more like a story he'd read than a life he'd lived. "After Shiloh, I came home changed. Broken, some would say. She tried to hide her disappointment, but I could see it every time she looked at me." "So you left." "She married a cotton merchant. Last I heard, they had 4 children and a fine house in San Antonio." He stared into the flames. I don't blame her. She deserved better than a bitter man who wakes screaming from nightmares. You are not bitter, Nasha observed quietly. Wounded, perhaps, cautious, but not bitter. The assessment surprised him. Most people saw only what he showed them. The solitary rancher who preferred his own company, who kept his words few and his attachments fewer. I'm past the age of falling in love, he said, the confession oddly freeing, of believing in new beginnings. Nasha was silent for a long moment, her expression thoughtful in the firelight. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but clear. My grandfather lived to see 90 winters. In his last year, he told me, the heart does not know time as the body does. It is always capable of beginning again. The words hung between them, carrying a weight beyond their simple meaning. Jacob found himself unable to formulate a response, touched by both the sentiment and the fact that she had shared it with him. They retired soon after, each to their separate sleeping areas, with dawn and their dangerous mission waiting. But as Jacob lay awake, staring at the ceiling, he found himself turning her grandfather's words over in his mind, wondering if an old soldier's heart might indeed be capable of beginning again after all. They departed before dawn, the eastern horizon just beginning to lighten as they guided their horses across the scrubby terrain. Jacob had asked his nearest neighbor, old Tom Wilkins, to check on his cattle in their absence. A request that had raised eyebrows but generated no outright questions. Some things were understood on the frontier without needing to be spoken aloud. Nasha rode slightly ahead, her knowledge of the land making her the natural guide. She had exchanged her dress for buckskin leggings and a loose cotton shirt, practical attire for hard riding and rough country. Her hair was braided tightly against her head, adorned only with a single eagle feather that carried some significance Jacob didn't ask about. They rode in companionable silence through the morning, each lost in their own thoughts as the landscape gradually changed around them. The relatively flat grazing lands gave way to broken country arroyos cutting through the earth, stubborn juniper trees clinging to rocky outcroppings, the occasional stand of piñon pines offering brief shade. By midday, the terrain had become decidedly more challenging. Nasha led them up a narrow trail that zigzagged between massive boulders, climbing steadily toward higher ground. Jacob felt the familiar pain intensifying in his back as the hours passed, but he kept pace without complaint, unwilling to show weakness. When they stopped to rest the horses near a small spring tucked against a cliff face, Nasha studied him with knowing eyes. There is no shame in pain, she said, reaching into her saddlebag. It is the body's memory, nothing more. Before he could protest, she handed him a small leather flask. Willow bark and yucca root. It will help without clouding your mind. Jacob hesitated only briefly before accepting the medicine. Pride had its place, but not when it might compromise their mission. The liquid was bitter but not unpleasant, and he nodded his thanks. The Apache will have lookouts posted, she said, as they prepared to continue. From here, we must be more cautious. No fires, no unnecessary talking. You're certain they'll be in these hills? Jacob asked, adjusting his rifle in its scabbard. Not certain, but it is what I would do in their place. She mounted her pinto mare with practiced ease. There are natural fortresses here, places where a small group can defend against many. As they rode higher into the hills, Jacob began to understand what she meant. The landscape was a labyrinth of narrow passages and hidden valleys, with numerous vantage points that would allow defenders to spot approaching enemies long before they arrived. It was perfect terrain for guerrilla warfare, the kind that had frustrated army commanders across the West for decades. By late afternoon, they had reached a high ridge that offered a commanding view of the surrounding country. Nasha dismounted and moved to a cluster of boulders, gesturing for Jacob to join her. Below them stretched a network of canyons, the shadows deepening as the sun westered. There, she said quietly, pointing to a distant formation where a thin wisp of smoke rose almost imperceptibly against the darkening sky. A fire, very small, carefully maintained. Jacob squinted, barely able to make out what she was indicating. Could be hunters, prospectors. No, look. She guided his gaze to the canyon entrance. Tracks, many horses moving in formation. He couldn't see the tracks from this distance, but he trusted her observation. How many, do you think? 15, perhaps 20 warriors, plus the captives. Her expression remained neutral, but Jacob sensed tension in her posture. We should find a secure place for the night, scout more closely after dark. They made camp in a natural hollow, screened by junipers, the horses secured where they could graze quietly on sparse mountain grass. With no fire permitted, they ate cold provisions, jerky, hard biscuits, and dried fruit. As the last light faded from the sky, as darkness settled around them, Jacob found himself acutely aware of Nasha's presence beside him, the faint herbal scent that clung to her hair, the quiet rhythm of her breathing, the warmth of her shoulder occasionally brushing his as they sat side by side against a boulder. The intimacy of their situation struck him suddenly, so far removed from the normal proprieties that governed relations between men and women. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That we're a long way from civilization," he replied honestly. "And that perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing." She was silent for a moment. "When I first came back from the white man's school," she said finally, "I felt caught between worlds. At the school I was never fully accepted, always the Indian girl, no matter how well I spoke English or how carefully I observed their customs. But when I returned to my people, I was changed, contaminated, some said, by white ways. And now I understand that the space between worlds can be a place of its own, not belonging fully to either, but seeing both clearly." She turned toward him, her face a pale oval in the darkness. "I think perhaps you understand that too." Jacob considered her words, recognizing their truth. Since the war, he had lived on the margins, physically present in society when necessary, but never fully part of it. His isolation hadn't been solely about geography. "Yes," he admitted, "I understand." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the soft calls of night birds and the occasional shifting of the horses. The stars emerged in brilliant profusion, the Milky Way a river of light across the velvet sky. "We should sleep," Nasha said eventually. "I'll scout the canyon before moonrise. You should remain with the horses." "I didn't come this far to sit in camp while you take all the risks," Jacob objected. "One person moves more quietly than two," she countered pragmatically. "And if I'm discovered, you'll be free to return with the information. The captives' lives depend on someone reaching the army." Her logic was sound, but Jacob still disliked the idea of her facing such danger alone. 2 hours, he said firmly. "If you're not back, I'm coming after you." A smile touched her lips, visible even in the darkness. 2 hours, she agreed, "but I will return." She prepared with methodical efficiency, checking her knife, securing her hair more tightly, rubbing dirt on her face and hands to reduce any reflection of light. When she was ready, she paused before Jacob, her expression serious. "If I don't return," she said quietly, "tell my mother I died helping children. She will understand." Before he could respond, she leaned forward and pressed her lips briefly to his, a gesture so unexpected that Jacob remained frozen in place. Then she was gone, slipping into the darkness like a shadow, leaving him with the lingering warmth of her mouth on his and a riot of unexpected emotions. Jacob touched his fingers to his lips, still feeling the impression of hers. In that simple, shocking moment of connection, something had shifted between them, something that could not be easily dismissed or forgotten once this dangerous mission was concluded. He settled against the boulder to wait, his rifle across his knees, his senses alert to any sound that might signal trouble. Above him, the vast wheel of stars continued their ancient rotation, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath their eternal light. The 2 hours Jacob had allowed stretched into eternity. He checked his pocket watch repeatedly, watching the minutes crawl by with excruciating slowness. Every sound in the darkness, a dislodged pebble, a night bird's call, the whisper of wind through juniper branches, sent his hand to his rifle and his heart racing. When Nasha finally materialized from the shadows, moving so silently that she was beside him before he fully registered her presence, the relief that flooded through him was almost painful in its intensity. "You're safe," he whispered, resisting the urge to reach for her. "Yes." She settled beside him, her breathing slightly elevated from exertion. "And I found them. The Johnsons? All of them?" She nodded, her expression grave in the faint starlight. "The parents and 3 children. They're being held in a cave halfway up the eastern canyon wall. 2 guards posted outside, perhaps 10 warriors in the main camp below. Condition? Alive. The youngest child appears ill, fever perhaps. The others seem unharmed for now." She took a small drink from her water skin. "They are being kept as bargaining pieces, as we suspected." "For what?" "Safe passage to Mexico, supplies, ammunition. Mano Sangriento knows the army is coming. He plans to use the family to negotiate or to ensure his escape." She hesitated. "There is more. I recognized one of the warriors." Jacob waited, sensing her reluctance. "My brother, Ashki," she said finally. "He rides with Mano Sangriento now." The revelation complicated matters considerably. Jacob studied her face, trying to gauge what this meant for their mission. "Will this change things?" he asked carefully. "Your willingness to help?" She met his gaze directly. "No. My brother made his choice years ago. The Johnson children deserve to go home to grow up with their parents, just as our children deserve to remain with theirs before the reservations." Her voice held no bitterness, only a deep sadness. "But I would spare my brother's life if possible." Jacob nodded, understanding. "Tell me everything you saw. We need a plan." Nasha described the layout of the camp in detail: the main fire where most warriors gathered, the separate cave where the captives were held, the placement of horses, the watch rotation she had observed. As she spoke, Jacob visualized the scene, considering and discarding various approaches. "Direct rescue is impossible," he concluded. 2 of us against a dozen warriors in their own stronghold, we'd never get the family out alive." "Agreed," she said. "But there is another way. The army company will reach Fort Sumner tomorrow, if they knew exactly where to find the camp." "One of us rides for help," Jacob finished, "while the other stays to watch the captives and ensure they aren't moved." "Yes." She met his eyes steadily. "I should be the one to stay. I can remain hidden better than you could, and if discovered might be able to parley through my brother." Jacob shook his head immediately. "Too dangerous. If they discover you, being Navajo won't protect you. They'll see you as a traitor helping whites. And if you're discovered, they'll kill you without question," she countered. "At least I have a chance of talking my way out." They argued in hushed whispers, each unwilling to put the other at greater risk. Finally, Jacob sighed. "The girl is sick, you said?" Nasha nodded. "Fever. She needs medicine." "And you're a healer," he said slowly. "If you were captured, and could you use that? Offer to treat the child in exchange for your safety?" "Perhaps." She considered the idea. "It would give me reason to be near the captives, a position of some value to them." "Then we compromise," Jacob decided. "I'll ride for the army at first light. You stay, but only to observe unless the child's condition worsens. If it does, You reveal yourself as a healer, only as a last resort. She weighed his words, then nodded reluctantly. Acceptable, but you must bring the soldiers directly here. No delays, no searching. The canyon is easily defended. If they suspect rescue is coming, they may kill the captives rather than lose their leverage. I'll make them understand, Jacob promised. With their plan settled, they should have tried to rest, knowing the coming day would demand all their strength and focus. Instead, they sat side by side in the darkness, the unaddressed moment of her kiss hanging between them like an unsung melody. Before you left, Jacob said finally, his voice low, "Why did you?" "Among my people," she replied softly. "When facing danger, it is customary to leave nothing important unsaid. No regrets to carry into the next world. And that was what you didn't want to leave unsaid." She turned to face him, her profile silvered by starlight. "Yes." The simplicity of her answer stripped away any pretense. In the vast emptiness of the New Mexico wilderness, with danger surrounding them and lives hanging in the balance, there was no room for the elaborate courtship rituals of civilization, no time for the careful dance of propriety and restraint. "I've lived alone for a long time," Jacob said, the words coming with surprising ease. "Convinced myself it was better that way, safer. As have I. But since you arrived at my cabin," he searched for words adequate to express the transformation that had begun within him. "It's as if I've been asleep, or half alive. And now you remember what it is to feel," she finished for him. "Yes." He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and touched her cheek with calloused fingers. "I thought that part of me died at Shiloh, that I was too broken, too scarred to ever—" She leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "The heart heals differently than the body. More slowly, perhaps, but more completely when it finds the right medicine." Jacob felt something shift within his chest, a loosening of bands that had constricted his heart for years, a warmth spreading through places long gone cold. With gentle deliberation, he leaned forward and kissed her, a gesture that felt simultaneously like a beginning and a homecoming. When they separated, Nasha's smile held a hint of wonder. "For a man who believed himself incapable of feeling, you express yourself quite eloquently." A low chuckle escaped him, the sound foreign to his own ears after so many years of solitude. "I've lived all my days dreaming of your arrival," he said softly. "I just didn't know it until now." The confession hung in the air between them, startling in its vulnerability and truth. They had known each other mere days, yet Jacob felt as if she had always been there, a missing piece restored to its rightful place. "Sleep," she said finally, though her hand remained entwined with his. "Tomorrow brings danger enough." They settled against the boulder, her head coming to rest on his shoulder, as naturally as if they had spent a lifetime together. Above them, the universe wheeled on its inexorable course, stars burning with ancient fire against the velvet darkness. Below, in the canyon, Apache warriors kept their vigil over frightened captives. And here, in this small space between worlds, two souls who had abandoned hope of connection found unexpected sanctuary in each other's arms. Dawn came with the pale clarity unique to desert highlands, a crystalline light that revealed every contour of the rugged landscape. Jacob prepared to depart while Nasha readied herself for the dangerous vigil ahead. Neither spoke of the previous night's revelations, but something had shifted between them, a quiet certainty that required no words. "The fastest route to Fort Sumner follows this ridge," Nasha said, tracing the path on her crude map. "If you push hard, you can reach it by nightfall." Jacob nodded, checking his ammunition and provisions one final time. "And you'll stay out of sight? No heroics?" "I will observe only," she promised, "unless the child worsens significantly." They both knew the promise was contingent on circumstances beyond their control, but it was the best assurance either could offer. Jacob secured his canteen and mounted his bay gelding, looking down at Nasha standing beside him. In the clear morning light, she appeared both vulnerable and formidable, a contradiction that seemed to define everything about her. "I will return," he said, echoing her words from the previous night. "With help." "I know." Her hand came to rest briefly on his leg, the touch conveying more than words could express. "Ride safely." With a final nod, Jacob turned his horse and rode eastward along the ridge, pushing the animal to a steady trot once they were safely distant from the Apache camp. He didn't look back, knowing that to do so would only make departure harder. Instead, he focused on the terrain ahead and the urgent mission that drove him. Nasha watched until horse and rider disappeared among the rocks, then gathered her few necessities and moved toward her observation point. A sheltered overhang with a clear view of the canyon below. She settled into a natural hollow screened by scrub brush, arranging stones and branches to further conceal her position. From her vantage point, she could see the main Apache camp, a cluster of temporary brush shelters near the base of the canyon wall. Horses picketed nearby, warriors moving with the casual confidence of men on their own ground. The cave where the Johnson family was held remained in shadow, but she could make out the 2 guards posted at its entrance, rifles across their knees. As the sun climbed higher, activity in the camp increased. Warriors gathered around a small fire for morning meals, scouts departed and returned, hunting parties organized themselves. Nasha watched it all with the patient stillness she had learned from childhood, her eyes constantly scanning for her brother among the Apache. She found him shortly before midday, a tall figure emerging from the main group to speak with the guards at the cave. Even at this distance, she recognized Ash Key's distinctive posture, the slight favoring of his left leg from an old childhood injury. He had been 16 when he left to join the Free Apache bands, refusing reservation life. She had been 20, newly returned from the white man's school, already caught between worlds in a way her brother couldn't understand or accept. Their paths had crossed only twice in the years since brief, tense encounters at trading posts where neither acknowledged their relationship publicly. The division between them was more than physical. It was the unbridgeable gap between those who chose resistance at any cost and those who sought to find new ways to survive in a changing world. Watching him now, directing the guards with the authority of a sub-chief, Nasha felt the familiar ache of loss. They had been close as children, before the soldiers came, before their father died defending their homeland, before different choices led them down separate paths. Her attention shifted as movement at the cave entrance caught her eye. A woman emerged, Mrs. Johnson presumably, carrying a small bundle that could only be the sick child. One of the guards gestured her back, but she appeared to be arguing, pointing repeatedly to the child in her arms. Nasha tensed, straining to hear their exchange across the distance, but the wind carried their voices away. The confrontation ended with the woman being forcibly returned to the cave, her protest visible in her rigid posture and resistant steps. Nasha noted with growing concern how the woman clutched the child, the unnatural limpness of the small form suggesting the fever had worsened. Throughout the long afternoon, Nasha maintained her vigil, moving only when necessary to avoid cramping muscles or to take small sips of water. The temperature rose with the climbing sun, the heat reflecting off canyon walls, creating a natural oven. She watched the camp through squinted eyes, noting the rotation of guards, the careful conservation of water, the strategic placement of lookouts at canyon entrances. These were men who understood survival in harsh conditions, who knew the land intimately, who anticipated the army's eventual approach. Their preparations were methodical and thorough, clearing firing lines, establishing fallback positions, securing their most vulnerable flanks. Nasha recognized the tactical wisdom in their arrangements even as she searched for weaknesses that might aid in the captive's rescue. As afternoon waned toward evening, a commotion in the camp drew her attention. The woman had emerged again, this time without guards, screaming and gesturing wildly. The child in her arms hung completely limp now, face flushed with fever even visible at this distance. Warriors gathered around her, some with weapons raised, others gesturing for calm. Nasha saw her brother step forward, placing himself between the distraught mother and the more aggressive warriors. His posture conveyed authority as he spoke, eventually leading the woman back to the cave himself, his hand on her shoulder in what appeared to be a gesture of reassurance rather than force. The sick child needed help, that much was clear. Nasha weighed her options, remembering her promise to Jacob against her healer's instinct to intervene. The child might not survive until rescue arrived. Her medicine pouch contained herbs that could bring down fever, ease breathing, fight infection. To withhold that knowledge while a child suffered went against everything she believed. Yet to reveal herself meant risking not only her own safety but potentially the entire rescue. If the Apache discovered an observer, they might move the captives or worse, decide they were no longer worth keeping alive. As twilight deepened the shadows in the canyon, Nasha made her decision. She would wait until full darkness, then approach the camp openly, as a healer offering help. Her brother's presence might provide some protection, and her medical skills would give her value beyond being merely a spy or enemy. Jacob would be furious when he returned with the army to find her in the Apache camp, but some choices transcended promises, even those made to a man whose heart had somehow become entwined with her own in the space of mere days. A child's life hung in the balance, and for Nasha, that outweighed all other considerations. The stars emerged one by one as darkness claimed the land, and Nasha began her careful descent toward the canyon floor, toward danger, toward her estranged brother, and toward a family whose salvation might require her own sacrifice. Nasha approached the Apache camp with deliberate visibility, her hands raised to show she carried no weapons. She walked slowly down the moonlit canyon floor, knowing the sentries had already spotted her, waiting for their challenge. It came swiftly. A sharp command in Chiricahua Apache from the shadows, followed by the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked. "I am Nasha of the Diné," she called back in the same language. "I come as a healer. There is a sick child among your captives." Two warriors materialized from the darkness, rifles trained on her heart. They conferred briefly, suspicious eyes never leaving her face. One spoke rapidly into the ear of his companion, who nodded and disappeared back toward the main camp. "Stand still," the remaining guard ordered in Apache. "Move and you die." Nasha complied, her heart racing despite her outward calm. Minutes passed before footsteps announced the return of the second warrior, accompanied by a taller figure she instantly recognized. "Ashki," she said softly as her brother stepped into a patch of moonlight. He stared at her with unconcealed shock, his hand tightening on his rifle. "Sister," he replied in Navajo, his voice a mixture of disbelief and wariness. "What madness brings you here?" "I heard a child cries with fever. I can help." She spoke clearly, aware that her life depended on his response. "I bring medicine." Ashki studied her face, his expression hardening. "How did you know of the White family? Who sent you?" "I have been at the agency," she answered truthfully, if incompletely. Word came of captured settlers. The agent mentioned a young one might be sick. Her brother's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "And you risked your life to help white children? The same whites who drove our people from their lands?" "I am a healer," she replied simply. "The child's blood makes no difference." A tense silence stretched between them, years of separation and divergent paths distilled into this dangerous moment. Around them, other warriors had gathered, watching the exchange with hands on weapons. Finally, Ashki spoke. "Search her. Rough hands patted her down, finding only her medicine pouch and a small knife, which was confiscated. When they finished, Ashki gestured for her to follow him. "If you betray us," he said quietly in Navajo as they walked, "I cannot protect you, sister or not." "I understand," she replied. "I come only for the child." The main camp was largely silent as they approached, most warriors sleeping in preparation for whatever action dawn might bring. A few remained awake around a small fire, their faces turning to watch Nasha's passage with undisguised hostility. Ashki led her to the cave entrance where 2 guards stood vigilant. Inside, illuminated by a small fire, Nasha saw the Johnson family, a bearded man who sat protectively before his wife and children, his eyes hollow with fear and exhaustion, a fair-haired woman cradling a small form close to her chest, and 2 older children huddled together against the cave wall, a boy of perhaps 10 and a girl slightly younger. "The healer is here for the little one," Ashki announced in halting English. Mrs. Johnson looked up, her tear-streaked face reflecting desperate hope as she registered Nasha's presence. "Please," she whispered. "My Emma. She burns with fever. She won't wake." Nasha moved forward slowly, conscious of the father's protective stance and the guards watching her every movement. She knelt beside the woman and gently moved the blanket to reveal the child's face. The girl was perhaps 4 years old, her cheeks flushed scarlet against otherwise pale skin, her breathing shallow and rapid. "How long has she been like this?" Nasha asked, placing a hand on the child's forehead. 2 days, Mrs. Johnson replied. "She was already sickly before they took us. The journey, the fear, it made her worse." Nasha examined the child carefully, noting the dry lips, the racing pulse, the unusual rash spreading across her chest. "Has she taken any water?" "Very little. She can't keep it down." Opening her medicine pouch, Nasha began selecting herbs, willow bark for fever, elderberry to fight infection, mint to settle the stomach. She worked methodically, aware of Ashki watching her every move from the cave entrance. "I need water," she said, "heated, if possible." After a brief consultation with the guards, Ashki nodded. One of the warriors brought a small pot of warm water from the main fire. Nasha prepared an infusion of the herbs, whispering traditional healing prayers as she worked. "This will reduce her fever," she explained to Mrs. Johnson. "We must get her to drink just a little at first." Together they coaxed the unconscious child to swallow small amounts of the medicine. Nasha then prepared a poultice of other herbs to draw out the fever, placing it gently on the girl's forehead and chest. "You should rest," she told the exhausted mother. "I will watch her." Mrs. Johnson reluctantly agreed, settling against her husband, who put a protective arm around her. The older children continued to stare at Nasha with a mixture of fear and tentative hope. "Are you Indian?" the boy finally whispered. "Yes," she replied. "Navajo, different from those who hold you." "Are you a prisoner too?" The question gave her pause. "No," she said carefully. "I came to help your sister." "Will soldiers come for us?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Nasha felt Ashki's gaze sharpen on her back. "I don't know," she replied honestly. "But your sister needs care now, regardless of what tomorrow brings." Throughout the night, Nasha tended to the child, replacing poultices as they grew warm, administering more medicine when the fever spiked again. Toward dawn, Emma's breathing eased slightly, her skin cooling beneath Nasha's touch. Ashki approached as first light filtered into the cave. "The child improves?" he asked in Navajo. "Yes," Nasha replied, "but she needs more care, more time." He squatted beside her, his voice low. "There will be no more time, sister. Mano Sangriento has decided we move at midday. The army approaches from the south." Nasha's heart contracted with fear and hope. Jacob had succeeded, but if the Apache fled with their captives before the soldiers arrived? "The child cannot travel," she said firmly. It would kill her. That is not my decision. Ashki's face was grim. Prepare her as best you can. As he rose to leave, Nasha caught his arm. Brother, she whispered urgently, these children are innocent. Whatever grievance you hold against the whites, innocent, he interrupted, his voice harsh though still quiet. Were our children innocent when the soldiers came? When our sisters and mothers were taken? When our land was stolen? This family did not do those things, she insisted. All whites are part of the same disease, he replied, though doubt flickered briefly in his eyes. You have lived too long among them, sister. You have forgotten who you are. I remember perfectly, she said. I remember our mother's teachings, that a life is a life, that suffering should be eased where found, that vengeance brings only more pain. Ashki pulled away, his expression closing. You have until midday. Then we ride, all of us, including you. Mano Sangriento will decide your fate when we reach the stronghold. As he left, Nasha felt cold dread settle in her stomach. Her attempt to help had resulted in her becoming another captive, with little improvement in the family's chances. Jacob would return with soldiers only to find an abandoned camp and vanished prisoners, unless she could find a way to delay their departure or leave a sign for those who would follow. Miles away, Jacob pushed his tired horse as the first light of dawn revealed Fort Sumner on the horizon. The bay gelding was lathered with sweat, having been ridden hard through the night with only brief rests. Jacob's back was a knot of agony from the hours in the saddle, but his determination never wavered. Nasha was waiting, the captives were waiting, and time was running out. Jacob rode into Fort Sumner as the morning bugle sounded reveille, his horse stumbling with exhaustion beneath him. Soldiers on the parade ground turned to stare at the dust-covered rider as he dismounted stiffly before headquarters, his movements betraying the pain in his back after the punishing ride. I need to see your commanding officer, he told the young sentry at the door. Immediately.
Sir, Captain Hayes doesn't receive civilians until... This concerns the Johnson family, Jacob interrupted. Captives of Mano Sangriento. I know their location. The sentry's expression changed instantly. Wait here, he said, disappearing inside. Minutes later, Jacob found himself standing before Captain Thomas Hayes, a veteran cavalry officer whose weathered face showed the strain of years fighting an elusive enemy across impossible terrain. Marshal Davis was also present, having arrived the previous day with his deputies. Mr. Reed, the marshal acknowledged with a nod. Didn't expect to see you here. Found the captives, Jacob said without preamble, his exhaustion making him brusque. Canyon camp about 40 miles northwest of here, 15 to 20 warriors. Families alive, but the youngest is sick. Captain Hayes leaned forward. You've seen them yourself. My companion did. She's watching the camp now. She? The captain's eyebrows rose. Nasha Begay, Navajo woman who works with Agent Parker. Jacob saw the immediate skepticism in the officer's eyes and pressed on. She speaks Apache dialects, knows the territory better than any scout you have. She risked her life to find these people. Marshal Davis nodded confirmation. Miss Begay has been helping us track the raiders. If she found them, I'd trust her information. Captain Hayes studied the map spread across his desk. Show me. Jacob indicated the location, describing the canyon's approach, the camp layout, the defensive positions Nasha had observed. We have a company ready to move, Hayes said. 60 men, but we'd planned to sweep south, based on earlier reports. South is wrong, Jacob insisted. They're in that canyon and they won't stay there long once they realize they've been discovered. And how would they know that? Hayes asked sharply. Jacob hesitated, unwilling to reveal that Nasha might have entered the camp herself, potentially compromising their element of surprise. Apache have scouts everywhere.
They'll spot a cavalry company miles away. Which is why we need to move immediately, Marshal Davis added. Every hour counts. The captain rose and called for his lieutenant, issuing rapid orders for the company to prepare for immediate departure. Turning back to Jacob, he asked, "Can you guide us there?" "Yes," Jacob said without hesitation, though his body screamed for rest. "But we need to send a smaller detachment ahead, faster riders who can reach the canyon before the main force. If the Apache flee with their captives, we'll never find them in that country." Captain Hayes considered this, then nodded. "Lieutenant Prescott will take 10 men and ride ahead with you. The main force will follow." He fixed Jacob with a hard stare. "But I warn you, Mr. Reed, if this turns out to be mistaken information." "It's not," Jacob said firmly. "And every minute we delay puts those children at greater risk." Within the hour, Jacob was mounted on a fresh army horse leading Lieutenant Prescott and 10 cavalrymen at a hard gallop toward the canyon. His back throbbed with each stride, but he pushed the pain aside, focused only on reaching Nasha and the captives before it was too late. Miles away, in the Apache camp, Nasha continued tending to young Emma, whose condition had improved slightly with the herbal treatments. The child was conscious now, though weak, her fever reduced to a low simmer rather than the dangerous blaze of the previous night. "She's better," Mrs. Johnson whispered, hope cautiously returning to her exhausted face. "Yes," Nasha agreed, "but she needs continued care and proper rest." She emphasized the last words, hoping the mother would understand her meaning. The child couldn't survive being moved, especially not at the rough pace of a war party fleeing pursuit. Outside the cave, activity in the camp had increased significantly. Warriors packed their few belongings, checked weapons, saddled horses. Nasha could sense their tension, the growing awareness that their position might already be compromised. Ashki entered the cave, his expression grave. "It is time," he said in Navajo. "Mano Sangriento wants the captives ready to move." "The child is still too weak," Nasha argued. "Another day of rest would—" "There is no more time," he cut her off. "Scouts have reported dust to the south. Soldiers." He switched to English, addressing the Johnson family. "You will prepare to leave now. Any resistance will be met with force." Mr. Johnson stood, placing himself between the warriors and his family. "My daughter can't travel," he said, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. "Surely even you can see that." Ashki's hand moved to his knife, but Nasha stepped between them. "Let me speak with Mano Sangriento," she requested. "Perhaps we can arrange for the child and her mother to follow more slowly with guards." Her brother studied her with suspicion. "Why would you care what happens to these whites?" "I am a healer," she replied simply. "My duty is to life, regardless of who carries it." After a moment's consideration, Ashki nodded curtly. "Come, but I make no promises about what the chief will decide." As they exited the cave into the bright midday sun, Nasha took careful note of the camp's activity, searching for any opportunity to delay their departure or leave sign for those who would follow. Her gaze fell on her medicine pouch, still clutched in her hand. Inside were not only healing herbs, but also a small knife she had concealed from the warriors who searched her, and a piece of red cloth that Jacob would recognize as hers. Mano Sangriento stood at the center of the camp, a tall, imposing figure with a face scored by old battle scars and eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts. His reputation for ruthless efficiency was well earned, and Nasha felt a chill as those flat, calculating eyes assessed her. Ashki spoke rapidly in Apache, explaining the situation. The chief listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving Nasha's face. "You claim the child cannot travel," he said finally in Apache. "Yet you offer no proof this is not a trick to delay us until soldiers arrive." I offer my skills as proof, Nasha replied in the same language. I have helped the child, but my work is not finished. If you force her to travel now, she will likely die. And with her, your leverage against the army. Mano Sangriento considered this, his expression unreadable. And you suggest? Allow the mother and sick child to follow more slowly with guards. The father and other children will ensure their cooperation. The chief's laugh was without humor. You think me a fool? The woman would slow the guards, allowing the soldiers to overtake them. Then keep me as well, Nasha said, making her decision in that instant. I will continue treating the child and ensure they move as quickly as possible. This proposal seemed to interest the Apache leader. He studied her with renewed attention. The Navajo healer offers herself as hostage, he asked, switching to English so the listening warriors could understand. Why would you do this for white captives? Nasha met his gaze directly. Because a child's life transcends the conflicts of adults. As Mano Sangriento weighed her proposal, a warrior burst into camp, shouting in Apache. Scouts had spotted a small party of soldiers approaching from the east, advance riders, moving much faster than the main cavalry force. The camp erupted into frenzied activity. Mano Sangriento barked orders. Warriors rushed to defensive positions, and horses were brought forward for immediate departure. In the chaos, Nasha saw her opportunity. As Ashki turned to confer with another warrior, she slipped the red cloth from her medicine pouch and secured it to a juniper branch near the cave entrance, a signal Jacob would recognize if he approached from the eastern ridge. Bring the captives, Mano Sangriento commanded. We ride west through the narrow pass. Nasha hurried back to the cave, finding the Johnson family huddled together in terror, the father attempting to comfort his wife and children while watching the commotion outside. Soldiers are coming, she told them quietly in English. But the Apache plan to flee with you. You must be ready. Mrs. Johnson clutched Emma tighter. My baby can't travel like this. I know. Nasha made a swift decision. From her pouch, she extracted a small packet of herbs. Mix this with water. It will help her fever during the journey. Then, ensuring no guards were watching, she pressed the concealed knife into Mr. Johnson's palm. If opportunity comes, be ready. The man's eyes widened in understanding as he quickly hid the weapon in his boot. Thank you, he whispered. Warriors entered the cave, roughly ordering the family outside. Nasha accompanied them, staying close to Mrs. Johnson and the sick child. In the clearing, she saw Ashki watching her with an unreadable expression as he held the reins of a horse clearly intended for her. You ride with me, sister, he said in Navajo. The chief agrees to your proposal for now. She nodded, understanding the implied threat. Her usefulness would be continuously evaluated, her life spared only as long as the child needed her care, and her presence ensured the mother's cooperation. The captives were mounted on horses, Mr. Johnson with his son before him, the older daughter behind another warrior, Mrs. Johnson cradling Emma while Nasha rode alongside with Ashki. As they prepared to depart, a single rifle shot echoed across the canyon, followed by shouts from Apache scouts at the eastern approach. Riders coming fast, one called in Apache. 10, maybe 12 soldiers. Mano Sangriento's expression hardened. Take the captives west, he ordered a group of warriors. The rest will hold this position long enough for you to reach the high country. Ashki turned to Nasha. Your white friends arrived too late, he said coldly. They are not too late, she replied, meeting his gaze. They are exactly on time. Something in her voice made him study her more closely. You knew they were coming, he said, realization dawning. You delayed us intentionally. Before she could respond, more gunfire erupted from the canyon entrance. The Apache warriors assigned to escort the captives began herding them toward the western trail, while others took defensive positions among the rocks. In the confusion, Nasha saw her chance. As Ashki turned to shout orders to his men, she slid from her horse and darted to Mrs. Johnson's side. When I create a distraction, she whispered urgently, ride hard for the Eastern Canyon entrance. The soldiers will be there. Mrs. Johnson nodded, her arms tightening around Emma. What about you? Don't wait for me, Nasha insisted. Get your children to safety. Returning to her horse, Nasha mounted just as Ashki rode back to her, suspicion evident in his face. Stay close, he warned. If you try to... His words were cut short by the thunder of hooves and the battle cry of cavalry soldiers appearing at the canyon's eastern entrance. At their head rode Jacob, his rifle raised, his face set with grim determination as he led the charge. Chaos erupted. Apache warriors opened fire from concealed positions. Soldiers returned fire while continuing their advance, and the captive family was caught in the middle. Their escorts now focused on the battle rather than their charges. Nasha saw the moment when Mr. Johnson acted, using the small knife she had given him to cut his bonds, then seizing the reins from his distracted guard and wheeling his horse toward the soldiers. His daughter, still mounted behind another warrior, screamed as her father's sudden action left her behind. Without hesitation, Nasha kicked her horse forward, charging toward the girl. Ashki shouted something she couldn't hear over the gunfire, but she ignored him, focused only on reaching the child before the Apache could regroup. The warrior holding the girl turned his horse to flee, but a rifle shot from the advancing soldiers struck him in the shoulder. As he fell, Nasha swept alongside, catching the girl before she could tumble to the ground and pulling her onto her own mount. Hold tight, she commanded, turning her horse toward the eastern entrance where Jacob and the cavalry continued their advance. Gunfire erupted around them as they galloped across the open ground. Nasha felt the girl's arms clinging desperately around her waist, heard bullets whizzing past, saw Jacob's face transform with recognition and relief as he spotted her riding toward him. Then pain exploded in her side. She looked down to see blood spreading across her buckskin shirt, but she didn't slow. The girl's safety mattered more than her wound. Jacob broke from the cavalry line, riding hard to intercept her. As they neared each other, more shots rang out from behind. Nasha twisted in the saddle to see Ashki standing among the rocks, his rifle lowered after having fired, not at her, she realized, but at a warrior who had been aiming at her back. Their eyes met across the battlefield, brother and sister divided by choices and circumstances but still bound by blood. He nodded once acknowledgement, farewell, perhaps even forgiveness, before disappearing into the smoke and chaos of the fighting. Then Jacob was beside her, reaching out to steady her as she swayed in the saddle. "You're hit," he said, his voice tight with fear. "The girl first," Nasha insisted, helping transfer the child to Jacob's mount. "Get her to safety." Together they rode through the cavalry line to where Lieutenant Prescott had established a defensive position. The Johnson family was already there, reunited and under protection as the battle continued in the canyon. "Medic!" Jacob shouted as he helped Nasha dismount, his arms supporting her as her legs threatened to give way. "She's wounded!" The army surgeon hurried over, helping Jacob lay her on a blanket spread on the ground. As he examined the wound, Nasha's vision began to blur, the sounds of battle fading as shock took hold. "Jacob," she whispered, reaching for his hand. "The child, Emma." "She's safe," he assured her, his fingers tightening around hers. "They're all safe because of you." "The bullet passed clean through," the surgeon announced. "She's lucky, missed anything vital. With proper care, she'll recover." Relief washed over Jacob's face as he bent closer to her. "You promised you wouldn't take unnecessary risks," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I promised I would observe," she corrected weakly. "I observed that the child needed my help." Despite the pain, she smiled up at him, feeling a strange peace descend. The battle was ending. Soldiers had overwhelmed the smaller Apache force, and those who could were retreating into the hills. The Johnson family was safe, and Jacob was here, his face the one fixed point in her increasingly hazy vision. "I thought I was past the age of falling in love," she murmured as consciousness began to slip away, past hoping for such things. Jacob's hand gently brushed hair from her forehead, his eyes never leaving hers. "And I've lived all my days dreaming of your arrival," he replied softly. "I just didn't know it until I saw you." 3 months later, Nasha stood on the porch of Jacob's ranch house, their ranch house now, watching the winter sun set over the mesa. Her side had healed completely, leaving only a scar to remind her of that day in the canyon. Behind her, the door opened and Jacob stepped out carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Cold out here," he said, handing her one. "Winter's coming early this year." "I don't mind," she replied, accepting both the coffee and his arm around her shoulders. "It's peaceful." After the rescue, much had changed. Agent Parker had formally commended Nasha for her bravery, while the Army reluctantly acknowledged that without her help, the Johnson family would likely not have survived. The children still wrote to her occasionally, especially Emma, who had fully recovered thanks to Nasha's early intervention. Of Ashki, there had been no word. Some Apache had escaped into Mexico, others had surrendered and returned to the reservation. Nasha preferred to believe her brother was among those who found freedom rather than those who found captivity. "Any regrets?" Jacob asked quietly, his eyes on the horizon where the setting sun painted the clouds in brilliant hues of orange and gold. "About staying here? About us?" Nasha turned to face him, studying the face that had become as essential to her as breathing. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the strong set of his jaw, the quiet strength in his gaze. "None," she said simply. "We've both wandered long enough between worlds. It was time to find home." As twilight deepened around them, they remained on the porch, 2 souls who had believed themselves beyond love until fate and courage proved otherwise. Behind them, a lamp burned in the window of their shared home, a light in the gathering darkness, a beacon of what was possible when hearts, against all odds and expectations, found their way to each other at last.